That night, the asphalt felt colder than usual. The red and blue lights blended into the darkness like a warning no one wanted to receive. The young man lay on the ground, feeling the weight of the world pressing against his back, while a voice above him sliced through the air, harsh, impatient, leaving no room for mistakes. Every second stretched like an eternity. The silence around him wasn't empty. It was loaded with anticipation, as if something was about to explode. He breathed in short bursts, not from exhaustion, but from fear. An ancient fear inherited, passed down from generation to generation, without ever being taught in words. His heart pounded too loudly, almost giving away his presence even though he remained still. His hands trembled slightly, not from guilt but from the brutal awareness that in that moment, any movement could be interpreted as a death sentence. The officer didn't see a young man. He saw a threat. He saw a body in the wrong place at the wrong time. The order came again, louder, more aggressive, as if volume could erase the humanity lying there on the ground. People watched from a distance, but no one came closer. Everyone knew. There were situations where just looking was already too dangerous. Inside the young man's mind, thoughts crashed into each other. Memories of his mother telling him to be careful, of his father teaching him to keep his hands visible, of silent promises he'd made to himself to come home that night. He swallowed hard. Something simple was about to happen, too simple to change everything, and too heavy to ever be forgotten. And then came the moment suspended in time, a gesture that seemed small, an inevitable movement, the kind of second that divides a life into before and after. No one there, not the young man on the ground, not the uniformed man, not those watching from afar, was prepared for what that moment would reveal, because sometimes the truth doesn't scream. It falls to the ground, along with the one who thought he was in control. His name was Elijah, 22 years old, too young to carry so much weight on his shoulders, but old enough to already know the world wasn't kind to people like him. Every morning, Elijah woke before the sun rose, not because he liked the silence, but because silence was the only time life hadn't yet started demanding payment. He got up slowly, like someone already expecting exhaustion before the day even began. The house was simple, small, but full of dreams that hadn't yet learned to give up. Elijah helped his mother with the bills, split what little he earned, and saved the rest with near-obsessive care. He believed, or tried to believe, that effort was enough, that working hard, speaking softly, and following the rules would keep everything under control. But there were things no amount of effort could prevent. On the way to work, he felt the stares. They weren't always openly hostile. Sometimes they came disguised as suspicion. Other times as excessive silence. People clutched their bags tighter. Stores had cameras that seemed to follow him. Overly polite questions loaded with too much suspicion. Elijah noticed everything, and pretended to notice nothing. Swallowing it was safer than reacting. At work he was the hard worker, always on time, always available to cover extra shifts, always trying to prove something no one had asked for, but which he knew was required. Smiles were rare. Recognition was almost non-existent. Still, he kept going, because stopping would mean admitting the world had already decided who he was before it ever met him. That particular night, Elijah left work later than usual. The sky felt heavy, as if it knew something was wrong but didn't yet have the courage to warn anyone. He walked with steady steps, mentally repeating the rules he'd learned since childhood. Don't run, don't argue, don't look nervous. He just wanted to get home. That was all. And yet, fate seemed to be watching him too closely, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Elijah noticed the car first. Not the sound, but the presence. Lights reflecting off the windows of closed stores, appearing and disappearing behind him like a thought that refuses to leave. He kept his pace. He didn't speed up. He didn't look back. He pretended normalcy, because he'd learned early that any reaction could be interpreted as guilt. The car slowed down. The door didn't open. The siren didn't sound. Not yet. But the air changed. Elijah felt that familiar tightness in his chest, hard to explain to anyone who'd never lived it. It wasn't paranoia. It was collective memory. It was his body remembering stories that weren't his, but could have been. Hey, the voice came dry, emotionless. It wasn't a request. It was a warning. Elijah stopped. Slowly. every movement calculated as if he were disarming an invisible bomb. He turned just enough to show his face, keeping his hands visible, the way his father had taught him years ago, with an expression far too serious for someone so young. "Yes, sir," he answered, low, controlled. The officer asked simple questions, but the tone wasn't simple. "Where are you going? Where are you coming from? Why are you here?" Questions that for some were routine. For Elijah, they were tests. Every answer had to be perfect. He spoke slowly, breathing deeply, trying not to show the fear that was starting to seep inside. People passed by on the street. Some slowed their steps. Others pretended not to see. A couple crossed to the other side. An older man shook his head in silence. Elijah felt the weight of that collective gaze, as if the judgment had already been made. He was alone there, even surrounded by people. Hands on the wall. The order came short, non-negotiable. Elijah obeyed. He leaned slowly. The concrete was ice-cold, rough against his chest. He swallowed the anger, swallowed the fear, swallowed the pride. Inside him, something began to crack, not loudly, but deeply. And in that moment, he still didn't know. But that routine stop was about to become something no one there would ever forget. On the ground, now. The order came with a sharp push. Elijah lost his balance and fell hard, his chest slamming against the cold asphalt. The air rushed out of his lungs as if someone had pressed an invisible button. Before he could recover, the officer's knee pressed into his back, heavy, impersonal. "Hands on your head, don't move!" The world shrank for Elijah. All that existed was the cold ground, his shallow breathing, and that voice repeating orders like a soulless mantra. He did exactly what he was told. Hands open, fingers interlocked. No sudden movements, no words out of place. His heart beat so loudly, he was sure the officer could hear it. People started to gather. Cell phones appeared in the air, silent, watchful. The scene was too familiar to be ignored. A young black man on the ground, an officer shouting, a script the country had seen far too many times. Elijah felt his eyes burn, not from tears, but from a suffocating mix of humiliation and powerlessness. He thought of his mother, wondered if this would be the last thing she'd ever hear about him. "Slowly," the officer said, his hand already near his weapon. The tension was so thick it felt touchable. Elijah warned him. His voice came out shaky but clear. He explained he would comply, that he would only do what he was told. Each word felt too heavy to cross the air. Then, with the care of someone stepping on thin ice, he moved his hand toward his pocket. A simple movement, an everyday gesture, something no one there should have feared, but which, in that context, carried the weight of a verdict. What happened next wasn't immediate, it wasn't explosive. It was broken. The officer froze. His body stiffened for a second that lasted too long. The object slipped from Elijah's hand and hit the ground with a dry, small sound. Too small to justify the silence that formed around them. It wasn't metal. It wasn't a threat. It was paper, folded, yellowed by time. A photograph that seemed to have survived more than that street on that night. The image showed a black boy smiling, with crooked childhood teeth, his arm proudly resting on the shoulder of a police officer. The uniform was old but unmistakable. The smile was open, genuine, the kind that still believed in promises. The officer in the photo was younger, lighter. It was the same man who now stood there, armed, sweating, with his knee still pressed into the back of another young black man. The air left the officer's lungs as if something had been ripped out of him. His hands began to tremble before he could stop them. His eyes locked onto that image as if it had a voice, as if it were asking silently when everything had been lost, when protect turned into suspect, when serve and protect turned into learning to fear. He took a step back, then another. The weight of the gun on his waist suddenly felt unbearable. That photograph didn't show a criminal. It showed a bond, an old promise made to a child who trusted, and now that same promise lay stretched out on the asphalt, face pressed to the cold ground. The officer dropped to his knees, not from weakness but because he finally understood. Understood that it wasn't Elijah who was out of place. It was him. It was the system. It was the history that kept repeating, crushing the same bodies generation after generation, and in that instant, kneeling before the truth, He cried, not to be forgiven, but because it was already too late to pretend he didn't know. The silence was absolute. Cell phones lowered slowly. Someone brought a hand to their mouth. The officer was crying like someone who'd just been struck by something far bigger than authority, than power, than control. The kind of truth that doesn't ask permission and can no longer be ignored. In that instant, nothing was the same anymore. Not for Elijah, not for the man in front of him, not for those who witnessed the moment when force gave way to humanity. Too late, and yet devastating. The officer stayed there for seconds that felt far too long, on his knees, head bowed. The crying was no longer loud, but it continued, a broken, heavy crying, from someone confronted with something no uniform prepares you to face. Elijah remained on the ground, motionless, unsure if this was the end, or just another part of the nightmare. When he was finally given permission to stand, Elijah did so slowly. His legs shook. His body ached, but the physical pain was small compared to what had just happened. He stood without looking directly at the officer, as if eye contact alone could reopen something still bleeding inside. Around them, no one spoke. The silence was a collective agreement of respect, or of guilt. That night didn't end there. Videos circulated, comments appeared, opinions divided. Some called it a miracle, others a shame. But for Elijah, none of it felt real. He went home carrying a new weight, not the fear of dying, but the awareness that his mere existence had been enough to break someone who saw him only as a threat. In the days that followed, Elijah tried to resume his routine, waking up early, working, smiling when necessary, but something had changed forever. He came to understand that surviving didn't mean coming out unscathed. It meant carrying invisible scars, and also the silent responsibility of representing something bigger than himself, even without ever asking for it. The officer was never the same again, because there are encounters that dismantle old narratives, that force the gaze to remain where it once looked away. That simple gesture, that instant, turned authority into fragility, and exposed a truth many spend their entire lives avoiding. Elijah moved forward, not as a hero, not as a victim, but as someone who, that night, reclaimed something no one had the right to take, his humanity. And now I ask you, how many times has this story almost ended differently? How many more will end? If this story touched you, like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Here, we tell stories that hurt, but also remind us that behind every statistic, there is a life.